Hello there, I'm Mike Gould and I'm an author and teacher, and I'm going to be working with the experts at York Notes in English and English Literature GCSE to look at ways in which we can help you with your writing skills and other skills related to your GCSE English and English Literature. And in today's session, which I'm going to call Change It Up, we're going to look at how you can make very small changes to your writing which have a big impact. And so to that end, I want to talk to you a bit about what I mean by those changes. So I think when you talk about your writing, there are the large changes you make. For example, if you're doing an essay on Macbeth or one of your literature texts where you might look at the whole approach that you're taking, the whole interpretation, say, and that we might call them macro approaches. And then we might want to focus in on much smaller changes, which also have a big impact, which we might call micro changes. And today, that's the sort of change we're looking at. So micro changes, small changes to your work. And in particular, I want to look at how we can change up some of your sentences that you use in your writing and look at how that can really have quite profound and big impact on what you say. So let's start with a bit of a comparison to help us get going. And what I want to get you to think about is the idea of a combination lock. Now, you're probably familiar with those sorts of locks. They're ones you see you put on your bike or on your locker, and they usually have a number of rows with numbers on. And to get the right combination, you nudge the columns on each number until the right combination comes up, and bingo, you unlock the combination. And I want to think about sentences in that way, because sentences have sort of a row of categories, a bit like a combination lock. So let's take, for an example, a really simple, dull sentence that you might use in the beginning of a story, say, such as Jack threw the bag into the lake. Now, that's made up of a number of categories. We've got Jack, the subject of the sentence, threw, which is the verb, the bag, which is the direct object, into, which is the preposition, and the lake, which is the indirect object. Now, you don't really need to know all those terms to understand that that's how the sentence works. But by making a few small changes to those words, to some of those categories, we can have quite a profound impact on the meaning and really energize your writing and give it more impact. As I've said, you don't really need to know these category terms like preposition and so on, although it can be useful sometimes to know those things, to make changes. For example, we could just take two of the words in that very boring, dull sentence and change those categories and see what happens. So we could have, for example, Jack flung the bag into the lake. Now, what have we done by changing that? By using the verb flung, we suddenly suggest that Jack had some intention or purpose, that he was doing it perhaps in a hurry, and suddenly it begins to reveal something about Jack's character perhaps that wasn't there before with the more neutral verb through. So you can see just by those very simple category changes, you've changed the whole story really. And we could do so again. We could change another combination. So instead of the verb flung, we could have the verb heaved. And we could change the lake to the cellar. So Jack heaved the bag into the cellar. Again, there's some aspect of perhaps criminality or something to be hidden away. But the heaved tells us something new, which is the heaviness of the bag, which we didn't have with the other things, and so on. So those little small changes have a big impact on what you're trying to say. Now, you might say, what's the point of all this? All you're doing is changing a fairly ordinary sentence in a story. But actually, you could take the same principle and apply it to other types of work you do. For example, your GCSE English Literature essays. Again, let's take a very simple sentence from a GCSE English Literature essay on Romeo and Juliet. You might say something like, the love between Romeo and Juliet is apparent when they first meet. Well, that's perfectly accurate. But could you change up some of those words there? Let's try, the attraction between Romeo and Juliet is striking when they first meet. Now, you've done something different there because by using the word attraction, you're suggesting perhaps there's something to do with the physical, to do with maybe not so much love but desire that wasn't in the first sentence. And the idea that it's striking, that it's somehow maybe out of the ordinary, also adds to your interpretation. So again, those small category changes to sentences can have a big impact on what you're trying to say in your essay. And you can go further with that. You could think of other category changes or other words you could use instead of that. You could use the word connection. So the connection between Romeo and Juliet is startling when they first meet. Connection suggests something, perhaps a linkage between the way that they've connected on various different levels. Startling goes a bit further even than striking. What's startling about it? Is it surprising because he said he was in love with Rosaline? Again, you're opening up interpretations just by those simple changes to a few words in a sentence. So consider that when you're writing your essays, whether they're in language or literature, how those small changes can redirect your thinking in new areas. So as you've seen, the mere fact of considering changes when you might not have even thought anything you've done was wrong can throw up new ideas. It also works in another capacity, which is when you're looking at other writers' work. So you might be reading, for example, some poetry, and you're struggling really to get to grips with the language in particular lines and what the poet's trying to say. One of the ways to do that is, of course, just to focus on individual words and what they connote, what they suggest. If we take a famous line from William Wordsworth's poem Daffodils, it begins, "I walked about a bit fluffy as a cloud." Well, of course, that's not the sentence. The actual sentence is, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." And if you were to just look again at two of those categories, the verb wandered and the adjective lonely, then you begin to understand why he chose those specific words rather than using something more general, such as "I walked about a bit." The whole notion of wandered suggests a sort of rambling, free nature, but also perhaps slightly lost, as if not knowing his direction. And we know that Wordsworth spent a lot of time in his childhood in the Lake District, although this poem may have been written later. But it suggests that idea of freedom, of discovering yourself perhaps. And then the notion of being lonely as a cloud, interesting because it personifies the cloud. The cloud's lonely, as well as the poet. And so that suggests that connection between the writer and nature. And in Wordsworth's poetry, that was the key to understanding his work. The nature of romantic poetry was this idea that nature worked on the imagination. And so those two individual words actually give us quite a big clue to quite grand, important ideas. And I think when you look at studying poetry and English literature for your GCSE, that attention to detail, okay, you don't want to make too many sudden leaps of imagination, but just looking at the words and what words he might not or she might not have used in the poem can lead you to some quite interesting interpretations and connotations of what those words mean and suggest. So let's sum up what we've learned in this session. It's an obvious thing to say, but words, even individual ones, matter. That's easy to forget. Sometimes we think it's all about the big changes we make to our work. I've got to work harder, I've got to change the whole structure of my essay. And of course, sometimes those things are true. But actually, just by changing up small things, you can make your work more creative, you can give rise to new ideas, you can test things out. So don't be afraid to experiment with your ideas. It's bound to reap rewards. So remember, look at the simple things, the sentences you use in your creative writing, in your critical essays, and that will lead you to develop new ways of looking at things. Now we've got a file which you can download which sums up some of the key ideas in this video, and there's even a challenge for you to look at some lines from a well-known poem and see if you can change them up into something new. So remember, start small but think big.